Welcome to Higher Energy, a podcast created by the Association for Energy Psychology. I'm Paula Shaw, your host, along with my co-host, Bob Schwartz. Hey, Bob.
Hi, everybody.
Well, it's an exciting day. We've got a very exciting guest, somebody who's really, his work is like part of the cornerstone of ACEP, isn't it?
Yep.
Because EFT, meridian tapping, all of that goes right back to our very roots. And I don't know exactly when you came into ACEP, Bob, but I was there back I'm a founding member. So I was there back in the day when Gary Craig and a bunch of us crazies used to gather in Las Vegas. There wasn't even ACEP yet.
Yep.
And it was a very interesting time. So we have a very interesting guest to be with us today to talk about brain bliss, which I'm really looking forward to. So if you're ready, Bob, I guess I'll tell everybody a little bit about Dawson Church and then we'll bring him on.
Sure, go for it.
All right, let me just get my eyes on. All righty, Dawson Church is an award-winning science writer with 3 best-selling books to his credit. The Genie in Your Genes was his first one. Mind to Matter came after that, and now Brain Bliss. And this book demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. We'll be talking about neuroplasticity and other things that can really help us change the way our brain works. He's going to share, hopefully, the breakthroughs of energy psychology that have been so important in health and personal performance, and his work through EFT Universe. So I would say, without any further ado, Dawson, please join us. We got lots to talk to you about.
I am so excited to be here, Paula and Bob. Thank you for having me. And there's a lot to be excited about. I look forward to sharing that.
Absolutely, there is. Well, I think it's always kind of good to start at the very beginning. So tell us a little bit about, you're a really busy guy. We already know that. And you already wrote 2 books. But what inspired you to write Brain Bliss?
Well, I wanted to share with people just how happy you can get. And there's a real gulf between the MRI scans, the EEG studies of people who are super happy and the average person. Like in one study of Tibetan monks, they look at this wave called gamma. It's the highest brain wave we have. It's the signature wave of creativity, of integration. And those Tibetan monks with more than 10,000 hours of meditation under their belts, they have 25 times the gamma, the signature happiness wave of the average person. And so how do you even relate to that? I wanted to let people know it's possible to get way happier than you used to be. And my impetus for getting that happy came from being super unhappy, because I tell the story in Bliss Brain. When I was a teenager, I was not a happy human being. I was so wretchedly miserable. I was suicidal, I was depressed, I was anxious. I tell the story about how when I was 15 years old, I walked past a full-length mirror, looked at this kid with long hair, hippie clothes on, bell-bottom trousers, and this thought flashed into my mind, looking at my own face at 15. I said, my mental self-talk was, that is the saddest face I've ever seen in my whole life.
Oh.
So I needed to fix myself. I went to live in an ashram. I learned to meditate when I was 15. I learned energy healing. And so Bliss Brain really that was 50 years ago. That's the culmination of a long journey in spirituality and psychology to learn how to get happy. And I'm so delighted now to wake up and, that kid I'm describing in the book, that I don't know who he was, or I sort of have a dim memory of him, but I want to let people know that you can get dramatically happier as shown in your brain function, and that then produces dramatic changes in brain anatomy. So that's the possibility of Bliss Brain.
And it doesn't take 50 years, does it, Dawson?
That doesn't take 50 years, Bob. I got to say, I was doing a lot of Gestalt therapy classes in the 1990s, and there were 9-day classes, learning all this stuff. And I made incremental progress. When I learned energy psychology, I found issues in my life changing that had been unchangeable by any other method for decades. So it doesn't take long at all.
Mm. So is this happening now through neuroplasticity? Is that the mechanism that brings that change about?
It's happening through neuroplasticity, and everyone knows now that neuroplasticity exists, although when Marion Diamond, the researcher who first discovered it in a big way in the 1950s, proposed it, the male psychological establishment was absolutely against the idea. But eventually there were enough studies to where her research caught on, and we now know that the brain does remodel itself and that neuroplasticity is happening all the time. What I really emphasize in Bliss Brain is the speed. And people do not appreciate the speed at which this is happening. Like in one study, the researchers found that doing Kirtan Kriya meditation for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, only 2 months, 12 minutes a day, that's almost a negligible time commitment, produced marked changes in the brain. Another study that I shared that's not published yet, but we showed that in 4 weeks, only 4 weeks of a particular kind of neural meditation, 22 minutes a day, that radical shifts happened in 2 parts of the brain. The part of the brain that is the core of suffering, it's the mid-prefrontal cortex over here, right between our eyebrows. That mid-prefrontal cortex is the seat of self, I, me, mine. And that part of the brain is what triggers the most suffering. That part of the brain in 4 weeks shut down. And the part of the brain to do with compassion that has these special neurons called von Economo neurons that are there in all social species like chimps and whales and other highly social species. Those von Economo neurons in the insula lit up. So in only 4 weeks of meditation, both the suffering part of the brain, the unhappy part of the brain turned off, and the part of the brain that has to do with love, compassion, connection turned on. And that's the good news about this work. It doesn't take 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours like those Tibetan monks or Franciscan nuns or other groups did. Those were good examples of how it's possible. But with today's tools, we now know you can produce a much happier brain in just 30 days.
So of course, the burning question everybody's asking, I'm sure, is, wow, what are the tools? How do you do it? Is there a specific particular meditation or kind of meditation, or does any meditation work?
No, in fact, all meditations are not equal. And the kind of way I learned to meditate in the ashram at 15 was, Dawson, close your eyes and still your mind. Now, right. 50 years later, Bob and Paul, I can't still my mind. If my life depended on stilling my mind, I'd be dead. So I can't do that. I still can't do that all these years later. And that's because the mind, the brain, is not designed to be still. I mean, basically, your ancestors 100,000 years ago, if their brain turned off, if their mind got still, they got eaten by the next predator. Your survival depends on your mind and your brain being highly active 24/7, even when you're sleeping. So that meditation instruction is not effective. And so I did spend all those years trying to figure it out. Wasn't a very successful meditator. Eventually, though, the research in Bliss Brain, I cover over 400 studies, and it shows that if you do certain things, you trigger rapid neural plasticity. But the saffron robes and the 108 prayer beads, maybe those are useful priming tools to get you in the mood to meditate. But there are only a few simple things you have to do, and it has to be body-based. Energy psychology actually is a bit of a misnomer, because our energy psychology tools actually help us get into our bodies. They're not energy in the sense of a vague, subtle energy, disembodied woo-woo something. They are literally changing neurological function. They're changing hormones. They're changing genes. They are the most directly effective way of actually changing the configuration of our bodies. And it's those meditation methods that shift our body function, our breathing, our respiration, our heart rate, our brain function. Those are the ones that are most effective.
I think a lot of people are really happy, because I know over the years, I learned TM years ago and other various similar, and at least then they said it was okay if your mind moved. If your mind, there was never the idea that you should be totally quiet. And that drives people crazy. They think, well, I can't do it. I can't make my mind still. And so they stop trying. So it's just this a horrible assignment that can't be done or not easily done. And then people figure, well, this isn't for me. And then they don't do it and they don't get the benefit.
That is such a huge point, Bob, and it's so right on. I can't tell you how many clients, I mean, I talk to everybody about meditating. I started with TM and I stuck with it, and I still meditate every day to this day. But exactly what you're saying, Bob, when I try to talk to clients about it, it's like, I can't be still. I can't keep my mind still. And it does discourage them. So Dawson, I couldn't be more thrilled to hear what you have to say. And reading in your book, even 12 minutes a day can be effective. That's huge.
It can. And you have, there are a number of networks in the brain. We used to think in terms of brain regions, a region for this and a region for that. We now know that that was a very partial picture, and our brain regions work in networks and circuits. And so there's one called the Enlightenment Circuit, which is highly lit up in Franciscan nuns who've spent 25 years in a convent, in those Tibetan monks who've spent many years in retreats meditating. And that Enlightenment network has components to it. And so we have part of the brain called the task positive network that's active whenever we're doing a task. So if you're thinking about composing an email, if you're reading a poem, if you're having a conversation, the task positive network is lit up. But when you stop doing a task, then the default mode network lights up, and the default mode network is that suffering network. The default mode network is thinking about the bad stuff of yesterday, so that, man, that saber-toothed tiger that almost ate me yesterday, I'm going to really be alert if I see one tomorrow. So it's all yesterday, tomorrow, and there's nothing about being in the present moment to the default mode network. And so that's the part that cranks up and it keeps us suffering. And so those nuns, those monks have learned to literally shut those regions down. They close their eyes, and that suffering self, that self-obsessed being simply isn't there anymore. And that's when they have these experiences of mystical union. They describe Rumi and Hafiz and Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint Francis describe these ecstatic states, the Quakers, the Shakers of early American spirituality. They would literally shake, and there's a section in Bliss Brain about orgasm, about how literally the neurochemicals of orgasm, like oxytocin, like beta endorphins, like norepinephrine, all of these neurochemicals are exploding in our brains in these deep states. So when you see Ramakrishna in ecstasy, or some great saint in samadhi, they literally are in such great bliss. There's almost no way to translate that into our everyday worlds. So the book is really wanting to let people know, hey, these states are trainable. They don't take going to the Himalayas, being in a cave, and you just got to get out of your default mode network and back into the present moment. And if you do that, then you trigger those neuroplastic responses. Those happy states then become lifetime resilient traits of literal neural wiring in your brain.
You know, one of the things I was really struck by, and I thought was so true in reading your book, you talked about how when we're in a reactive state, we're responding and focusing on past, not present. And boy, I so get that, Dawson, because in the last week, I've had a little trauma of my own in my life. I was literally driven from my house by a rat infestation. On my last night, I saw a very large rat run across my living room floor. And on that same day, had gotten word that my father had a stroke. My father is doing very well. I'm here with my parents now, taking care of them. But at night, I get just so much sleep, and then the rat dreams start coming back, the visions of what I saw, the rat droppings in various places in my house. So I see what you're saying, I'm reacting to the past. So if there's a magic way to get out of this, or something I need to do every day, please share it with me.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, because I mean, that really disrupts your whole life, and then you've had these two stressful things at the same time. And often those things converge, and if they get too much and too intense, then they can overwhelm us. And so the key part of there are 4 networks I talk about in Bliss Brain that are part of that Enlightenment Circuit in the brain. And the very, very, very first one I say you have to learn to develop is the emotion regulation network. And unless you can regulate those emotions of upset, anger, shame, disgust, resentment, whatever they may be, if you can't regulate those emotions, it's very hard to have a happy life. And then people who learn to regulate those emotions, like those Tibetan monks and Franciscan nuns, they are opening the path to a happy life. And people think that these nuns and monks have, just such ideal lives, and they have pretty good lives, but, a lot of them were tortured or driven from their homes, or many of them are refugees. And so they have stuff going on. But when you are firing those circuits of happiness over and over and over again daily in meditation, say half an hour every day, they get bigger. In one of the case studies in Bliss Brain, I talk about an astrophysicist who's also a TV reporter called Graham Phillips. And he'd heard about meditation, was a little bit skeptical, but said, I'm going to give it a try. And he said, I'm going to go on an 8-week meditation journey. So for 8 weeks, he did mindfulness meditation every day, and he had a TV crew film him in his mindfulness process. And before he began, he went into a really advanced MRI lab and got a whole bunch of high-resolution MRIs done of his brain, had a whole bunch of tests of cortisol and all kinds of other stress and internal neurochemicals, and then began his meditation practice. And within 2 weeks, he felt better. Within 4 weeks, he was much less stressed. In 8 weeks, he went back in the lab, they measured his brain, and parts of his brain had grown by 2 or 3 or 4%.
Wow.
In only 8 weeks. But one part of his brain grew the fastest, and it's a piece of tissue in the center of the brain called the dentate gyrus. And it's responsible for emotion regulation across brain regions. It coordinates emotion regulation across many different regions of the brain. His dentate gyrus, in only 8 weeks, grew by 22.8%. That's how fast positive feelings, happiness, joy, compassion, altruism are literally reshaping the anatomy of your brain. I mean, think about that. You're literally changing your brain anatomy by the quality of your thoughts, consciousness, and feelings.
And that's how in your book you say what you do changes your brain because of doing this kind of thing, like having more positive thoughts. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Every thought you have, like I have one little image in the brain from a scanning electron microscope, and it's showing these 2 neurons connecting. And so you see one at the top of the screen, one at the bottom of the screen, and then a signal's passing between the 2 neurons, and they literally reach out and touch each other. This is a real-time electron microscope image of 2 neurons joining. And that process in that electron microscope sequence took 12 seconds. So if you spend 12 seconds, like for example, my wife, Christine, loves roses. And so right now we have all these roses on the dining room table, and she'll smell them. She'll say, Dawson, notice how this rose smells different from this rose. And she's like, we'll go to her rose garden and we can spend 2 hours there just smelling the different roses. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, if you spend 12 seconds just taking in the good, just breathing in the blessings of your life, of giving thanks, of being grateful, of harboring positive emotions, just 12 seconds, and you make new neural connections. Make lots and lots of them, and suddenly you go from being that wretchedly unhappy person to being a person who's having happy experiences, triggering neuroplasticity, and becoming a dispositionally happy person. You've turned happiness from a state into a long-term trait. And that's why when you have the rats, when your parents get old, you're going to die one day. We're all going to die at some point. I actually had one of my really good friends die really unexpectedly about 4 days ago. And you feel it. I mean, my wife and I, we cried, we tapped together, and yet we are aware of all of the beauty of her life, and we celebrate that as well. But you then form these neural circuits, and they make you so resilient. So there are the rats, they're your parents aging, there's always stuff, there's your body as it gets older, and yet if you are a resilient person, if you turned these from states to traits, they can never be destroyed. They're inside your own head, and you're basically just happy every day, and not just happy a little bit, that 25 times the amount of gamma, that's super happiness, that's bliss brain.
So if I understand you correctly, Dawson, and I just want to clarify this for people that are listening to this that may be brand new to this work. So let's say a trauma happens like me and the rats. But so are you saying if I've already been doing work to be more positively focused and all of that, I have a brain that's going to handle it better? Or do I specifically need to try to associate gratitude and taking those moments like you described with the rose while I'm thinking about the rats?
It's cumulative. The more you practice it, like, you know, I watched the movie Aquaman with my wife a few nights ago, and the star of the movie is this really heavily muscled dude. And
Yes.
so I just, you know, just being an inquiring frame of mind, I said, you know, Jason Momoa, what is the diameter of his biceps? Now I know the diameter of the biceps of the average man his age is 16 inches. Turns out his are close to 20 inches. I mean, this guy has absolutely massive muscles, and he got them by working out. And the same thing happens in your brain. If you just work out those happiness, joy, gratitude circuits day after day after day, deliberately putting yourself in that consciousness, then you're turning mind to matter. That was the title of my previous book, Mind to Matter. You literally turn mind to matter. Now think about this. Your dog, your cat, a chimpanzee, a crocodile, a dinosaur, a lizard, no other creature can literally create its own neural wiring volitionally by its own consciousness in the space of a few weeks. And we can. We can literally grow a happy brain over time. It's outrageous. This is the way Jason Momoa does all these workouts and has 20-inch biceps. You want to have 20-inch happiness circuits and 20-inch gratitude circuits and 20-inch altruism circuits.
Right.
It just fundamentally changes your whole life. And it's not like we have perfect lives. I mean, you know, as in Bliss Brain, I talk about all kinds of problems that we've had in our lives. I have this first chapter about the fire that destroyed our home in a few minutes, and how we drove out through the flames. And, you know, it's not like the wildfire passed us by. It burned our house, and I burned down our office and did all these things. But we were resilient because we had these practices. And that's the good news, is you then have this not just as a practice, you have it literally as the anatomical structure of your brain. You have a wise, happy, healthy, resilient brain. And I can tell you, having had a miserable brain at 15, and now in my mid-60s, having a happy brain feels
a lot better.
So I know we're gonna. I'm sort of aware of the time here, Dawson. Is there anything on this? Well, first of all, obviously, in the book, you talk to people about how to do this, literally, right?
Absolutely. I want them to have tools of doing this. Energy psychology is the primary thing they do, and meditation.
So actually, well, let me get to another question. So, you know, I know we EFT, tapping, whatever. So that's one kind of thing, which is really more about focusing on, usually, about cleaning up problematic areas, you know, trauma, whatever. But meditation, at least the way I tend to think about it, is more like building the positive. Would that be a fairly reasonable way to say it? Because and they're both good. They're different.
And my belief, actually, research bears this out, is you need both. And so meditation produces a baseline of well-being, and you need that. You need that baseline of well-being. You need that baseline of spiritual and moral development as well, that meditation and the discipline of it produces. But then one of my real, I feel the real limitation of a lot of meditation teachers and teachings is that they do not recognize the role that unprocessed trauma has in sabotaging our well-being. And, you know, you can't just go there. Like the spiritual community I was part of eventually just exploded in a whole wave of scandals and problems. And we were told, you just transcend all that stuff. And unfortunately, the research shows you don't. You have to get there into the dark side of your personality. You have to go there into your trauma, and you have to process it. And that's where energy techniques are absolutely essential. EFT, other forms of energy therapies, you absolutely have to do that. I wish there was a free pass. You just get to nirvana without cleaning out the basement, but unfortunately, you got to do both.
But I think the point that you're making, there's the both path is preferential. If you I mean, if you just do the meditation, don't clean up your trauma, well, that leads to certain problems. But I know plenty of people, they work on their trauma, they tap, whatever, and they're still unhappy because they're not building up enough positive stuff, the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a both and.
And if you look at the history of energy therapies, David Feinstein and I, we had this big project in 2009, 2010 to write the Energy Healers Ethics Handbook and put together the ethics course for both EFT Universe and also Eden Energy Medicine. So we did this all in 2009, 2010 because there were scandals and these spiritual teachers, and think about James Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart in Christianity and Chögyam Trungpa in Buddhism, and I mean there's just been this endless stream, John of God being exposed literally a year and a half ago. Oh yeah, no, exposed as being molesting his daughter since she was 15 years old, and molesting he's now in jail for molestation. I mean, we have all these people who have these enormous gifts, and yet if you don't take care of the ethical aspects and clean up your personal stuff, the dark side is there. And so yeah, Bob, you absolutely have to have that development as well as the stress reduction effects of a technique like EFT.
Right.
You know what I think is so important about that question you just asked, Bob, and I'm so glad, Dawson, you clarified that, because we've all experienced people who something tough happens and they're like, well, I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to meditate. I'm just going to rise above it, or that sort of thing. And that doesn't usually cut it, not in a real way. And so I love what you just said, that we need to marry both if we're really going to have something that's solid and that grows and builds, so that, we can't control life, right? But we can control our responses to it, or build our ability. I think I hear you saying, Dawson, build our ability to respond to it in a productive way.
Yeah, and you have to have both those things in place. You need the stress reduction because a lot of meditators, they meditate, but then something bad happens. They have to stand in line, their car breaks down, they have some kind of a loss, and then they are in that state for a little while in the morning, but then they lose that during the day. And so that's where tapping helps me. If I have something happen that disturbs my inner peace, I go tap right away. I don't want to let it go on for an hour or 2 or 3 or 5. I want to just tap on it and let it go just like that. But then you need to have that baseline of serenity and well-being, and that comes from meditation. Tapping alone, again, in the whole tapping world, there have been people who were megalomaniacs and scandal prone and doing all kinds of things that we now recognize we've had to put these ethical standards in place were really uninformed. And so you need to have that baseline of well-being. You need to work on yourself. We insist that our certified practitioners not only do personal work as part of certification, we send them to psychotherapists. We have them do therapy, and then they have to keep on doing it. It's not like when you graduate as a certified practitioner, then you're like, okay. You have to keep on doing your personal work every single year. And so it's necessary to do that spiritual and moral and ethical development continually. And then you have that baseline of well-being. You tap away the stuff that takes you away from that baseline, but then you return. And the cool thing about Bliss Brain is we now are measuring its effects past the meditation period in the day. And like there's one of the sections in Bliss Brain talks about the research of Teresa Amabile at Harvard, who showed that you enter that state, and then when you do that for an hour, it literally means that the next 48 hours of your life, you're more creative and you're more productive. A 10-year study by McKinsey showed that people in that state have 5 times the productivity of people who aren't. And a DARPA study, Defense Research Agency, showed that they have 490% the ability to solve complex problems. So now you aren't just feeling better in meditation, you aren't just getting back there quickly during the day, you're 5 times as productive and you're much more able to solve complex problems. So suddenly your life just gets a huge amount better, and you start to have flashes of spontaneous happiness. You just go into Bliss Brain many times a day. You can't stop yourself. It just becomes the foundation of who you are. And that's possible with just a little bit of training and developing that enlightenment network.
So you've answered the question before I've asked it, which clearly you're prescient. So one of the big objections I think people have is, you don't understand. I'm so busy. I am so overwhelmed. I don't have the time to meditate for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever the number is. If you could say 4 minutes, it wouldn't matter. They don't have that time either. But what you're saying is, well, I hear you, but you're going to get a 400% increase. So make the time.
You don't have the time not to meditate.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Bravo.
Let's say that again. What? You don't have the time not to meditate.
You know, Bob, in the last like 4 weeks, I had one really bad day. I just had one day that my biorhythms were off. I just had a rotten day. And that was the only day in the last 4 weeks I didn't meditate. And I think it, like plugging in your cell phone. I mean, you wouldn't expect your cell phone to last for 5 days without ever being plugged in. Just plug in. Spend that half hour plugging in. 5 times the productivity. I mean, you are such a, you're living your life. You're playing the game at such a high level when you do this. It's totally transformative. So you don't have the time to not meditate.
And you know, Dawson, it also really impacts us physically as well, right? Because I've been meditating since I'm in my 20s, and I just had my 70th birthday, and I feel like I'm still much younger than I am. My energy is good, my attitude is good, but I'm like you. I won't go a day without starting my day meditating. And I think that's a big piece of it, right? I mean, there is physiological impact as well, correct?
Massive physiological impact. In one study, a 30-year study of about 2,000 men and women, they looked at the link between attitude, specifically optimism, and longevity. And they found that those people who are optimistic are far more likely to reach 80 years old and live another 10 years longer than pessimists. I mean, optimism, just that consciousness shift produces a 10-year gain in longevity. Another study done recently of Alzheimer's patients found that the thing that predicted the development, the accumulation of beta amyloid plaques in their brains the most strongly was negative thinking, more strongly than anything else. And the effect scaled. The more negative thinking, the more beta amyloid plaques in your brain. So literally, a negative consciousness kills and inhibits your body's ability to produce a whole variety of enzymes, a whole variety of gene expression. In another study, an hour of EFT changed 72 genes, and those included genes that code for things like the suppression of esophageal tumors, of bowel tumors. It coded for the protection of your skin from the sun's ultraviolet rays. Those genes coded for the strengthening of the neurons in the memory and learning centers of the brain. All of these things from 1 hour of EFT. So you can radically shift your physiology by shifting your consciousness. These aren't just metaphysical pursuits that are of no practical use. They're producing a dramatic effect on your level of health and longevity, as well as that of your happiness.
Which gets back to what you said a minute ago. You don't have the time not to meditate.
Amen. And build a better brain. That's what I heard you say too. And I know your book is available on Amazon, Dawson. If people want more information about your work, where can they find that?
Well, a couple of places. The most useful place to go right now is if you go to Dawson, my name, just DAWSON, gift.com. What I've just put up there in the last few weeks is we did a study about 4 years ago, and we had one secondary outcome. So in studies, we have primary outcomes you look for, and you have secondary things. You're just measuring these because you're interested in seeing what they are. One of the secondary outcomes of that study was actually 2 studies. One of eco-meditation, this method I teach, and the other was of EFT. And we looked at the levels of immune function of people, specifically their levels of antibodies, the very antibodies that protect against coronaviruses. Now, we had no intention, or obviously we had no idea COVID was coming, but we just happened to measure as a secondary outcome the level of these circulating antibodies in people's mucous membranes. And we found, and I just get these numbers. I mean, I'm getting chills when I talk about this. So the weekend of eco meditation produced a rise in those antibodies of 27%. People were tapping through the weekend, they were meditating through the weekend, 27% higher antibodies after the weekend. The week of EFT, they were meditating every morning, doing EFT for the week at a retreat center. After a week of EFT, their antibodies, their immune antibodies, rose by 113%. So at that DawsonGift.com, I've done a special meditation which focuses on the immune boosting effects of all this stuff, because I mean, if you can raise your immunity 10%, that's great, but 113% in a week is crazy. And so that's why I'm really wanting people to go there, because I put that immunity meditation at the very top of DawsonGift.com. I want people to use that. It's free. I want them to have high immunity, not just, I mean, this year and next year, but going into the future as well. It's really important to support your body in this way.
Absolutely. That's huge.
I think that's a good place to end.
I was just going to say, Bob, unless you have any other burning questions for Dawson.
DawsonGift.com.
DawsonGift.com. Dawson, you've been a gift to me today. I've ordered your book, and I will be doing those practices because I don't want to live with this rat thing forever. But thank you for the clarity you've really helped me see as to, the path out of this. So bless you for all that you shared with us today.
Oh, I love doing it, and I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much for sharing it with this wonderful ACEP community. I've been a member of ACEP since the very first week I heard about ACEP. So and I encourage all of our practitioners to be members as well. So it's just a powerful organization that's done a lot to shape the conversation, especially as we enter now the period when these alternative therapies are now mainstream psychology and medicine.
Yes,
Excellent.
yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to all our listeners for joining us here on Higher Energy. We'll see you again soon.